This is a workshop on Yahshua to Yeshua. And this is a preparation for tonight's epic telling, but it is also to set this epic telling in the context of thinking biblically about the struggles in the world. So the goals for this are to identify the deep structure of narrative first. This will be an outline of the actantial analysis, the analysis of actantial structures of narrative from Alexandra Grema. It's pretty simple on the surface. We could spend a lot of time on that, but this is enough. Then that we will identify and trace the deep structure of the stories, of the major big stories in the biblical tradition from Joshua to Jesus. And third, that we'll utilize that deep structure to identify options in the present global conflict. So this is going to be a very different biblical storytelling workshop. This is identifying the ways in which the stories that are present in the deep structures of the unconscious mind of nation states and religions in the world, how they shape the alternatives that are identified for dealing with the problem of, quote, evil in the world and, quote, enemies in the world, and identifying how those structures are present in biblical narrative, the changes in those as they have developed, and then the choices that we are making in relation to the deep structures that we choose as national groups and as a human community to utilize in our identification of how to respond to the problem of what could variously be called structural evil, enemies, warfare in the world. So this is the goal of this workshop, is then to look at the present conflicts in the world in the broadest perspective possible, to identify the stories that underlie that conflict and options that are present in relation to the stories that we may choose in relation to how we understand the conflicts that are happening in the world. So, this will be an interactive workshop. I don't have all this figured out. I know in general what I want to do and the process that I want to follow, but I don't, and I know in general what I think about these structures. So I can guide us, and I will do that. But I don't know the answers to this. This is a first step in what I hope will be in your work and in the work of the network, and hopefully in the research and development instruments of the government of the United States, the military political complex, the religious communities of the United States and of the world. Now, how that will happen, I don't know. But I do know that thinking new thoughts is itself generative. And I know from experience that whenever it is that I have identified something that I think nobody else is thinking, you can be sure that there's somebody else in other parts of the world that is thinking the same thing. I've experienced that a number of times in my life. So I'm sure that's the case. So we don't know where this will lead. We don't know what the results of thinking these thoughts will be. But it will be generative. We don't know when, we don't know how. But the first step is to think in the structures of the revelation of God and of how it is that God has communicated to the human race about how God intends to save the world. So, and to save the people. Okay? Questions about this? Reactions? You didn't know what you were getting into because there was not a clear description of this in the workshop. And so if you want to talk about these goals a little bit, that's fine with me. And if you want to ask questions about it, you know.
Well, we're all in the same world, and it doesn't look good, so.
We have major problems. And one of the problems is that we are frozen in relation to thinking about alternatives to warfare as a way of dealing with structural problems of conflict. And
we've made it an either or kind of thing.
right. So that's one of the goals of this. I was just at a think tank in Dayton on Friday where I made a brief presentation about Jesus and nonviolent resistance. And on Friday night, this is at the Wright Institute, which is a think tank that has been organized by the Air Force at the largest military Air Force base, military establishment in the world, namely Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. The estimate from the person who is part of this circle of conversation, which is a group of Roman Catholic and Protestant leaders in the Dayton area, all of whom are in various positions of significance in the military, in the church, in the judicial system, in the universities of the area. So but all of them Christians. And so it's a circle of conversation organized by a Marianist brother, Victor Forlani, who teaches in the business school at the University of Dayton. And so we met at the Wright Institute, which is a think tank that has been organized by the Air Force because the general in charge of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base said, we can't think as a community. This is a $30 billion operation every year. That's the general picture of the budgets that are spent at Wright-Pat. And he says, but we can't think. We're all locked in relation to present expectations, structures, ways of thinking, and we have no free space. We need that. So he hired Bert. He said it was easy. It was cheap. It only cost us $500,000 to set up this center. And then we have an operating budget of another $3 million or so in order to bring people in, and they use their budgets to do this. But what they do is they bring together people from 30 to 40 people who will commit to spending half of their time, a minimum of half of their time for anywhere from a month to 6 months at the Institute thinking about problems. Now they approach all kinds of problems. How to decommission an Air Force base in Iraq with the least amount of loss and of life and equipment. Various technical problems in relation to global computer systems, radar, in relation to the development of the next generation of stealth aircraft. So they define a problem. They bring in 30 to 40 people. They work on it for a month to 6 months. The basic principle of this center is that the major problem in research is that people run to solutions rather than staying in what he calls the problem space. What's the problem? And once one identifies clearly what the problem is, solutions are relatively easy to identify. But identifying clearly what the problem is very difficult. So I outlined him for the group the problem, which is that in relation to the present war in Iraq and the response to the 9/11 attacks, that we simply jumped as a nation to the solution. First, the analysis of the problem, global terrorism, Islamic terrorists, and the solution. Because we had spent all this money on a defense system and on a military, the obvious answer is warfare. We go to war and we try to kill those who are responsible for this attack. That happened almost instantly with virtually no thought, no research, no reflection, no time in the problem space. And so I said to the group, my perspective as a biblical scholar, and specifically as a New Testament scholar, is that the stories of the Gospels and of the New Testament outline a completely different framework in which this could be thought about. Has it been considered? And Bart answered, no, obviously not. So he's interested in thinking about this. So what I want us to do is to constitute ourselves as a Christian think tank in which we will try to analyze the problem of structural evil. And I'm going to propose a very simple structure for that investigation, and that we spend then the next hour thinking about that. My expectation isn't that we're going to, solve the problem, but it may be that we can come to some greater clarity about the problem. And my hope is that this will be the beginning of an ongoing process of thought and reflection on the structures of sacred narrative as they inform and shape public, national, and religious policy in relation to global conflict and conflict resolution. So, are you up for this? Okay. One further word. You are all experts on the subject that we're going to investigate here. And one of the things, and the reason for that, is that you all know individually, in distinctive ways, the way in which the structures of biblical narrative have been appropriated in your experience. So that's part of what I want you to identify in this, is to try to think down to what is the underlying structure of thought that you have been taught, have experienced, observed, and that you bring to thinking about global conflicts. So, a short prelude. Yahshua, Yeshua. In my exegetical piece that's in your packets, I explored the fascination of these two words. Yahshua is a Hebrew name which means God saves. And that is indicative of the subject of the book. Yeshua is the same word, the same name, with a minor variation in the vowel, Yahshua, Yeshua. That is the name of Jesus. So Jesus is a transliteration of Yeshua, the Hebrew name, into Greek. And so there is a straight line of continuity between the two names. And the basic underlying structure of the understanding of God saves through Jesus is rooted in Yahshua. So that's part of what we want to identify, is what are the lines of continuity and discontinuity between Yahshua and Yeshua. And because that clearly has shaped this understanding. Now, my assumption in this is that in ways that finally I don't understand, these stories identify a deep structure of knowledge about God and of the ways in which that has emerged over the centuries. And that there was a kind of cumulative wisdom that developed over the centuries in the formation and development of the biblical narrative tradition. And that we can think and learn from the evolution of that structure. And we can also identify the ways in which that has shaped and forms, then, the ways in which we think about that now. But so this development of the name is also related to deeper structures of human experience of God. And it is finally a statement of, I wouldn't call it so much faith as I'd call it, for the purposes of this, a hypothesis. It might be that this structure really does reveal something foundational about how God intends to save the world, to put it in metaphorical terms, to put it in other terms, about the ways in which we as a human community can identify the spiritual sources for the resolution of conflict in ways that will lead to peace rather than to global destruction. So, the deep structure of narrative. Grema proposes that all stories have this foundational structure. That there is a sender who sends some object or mission, something, to a receiver. This might be that the president is sending salvation, health, deliverance, whatever, to the settlers in the West. This is just an example of a story, okay, that is widely told in various versions in the United States. There is a subject who then is going to deliver this message. This could also be God is sending salvation or peace to the world, or Yahweh is sending the land to the people of Israel. There is a subject who is the primary agent of this action. This might be then a general, a messenger, an army. It might be Moses. It might be Jesus. This is a structural role. It might be Jack going up the beanstalk. The subject has a helper. This might be the case of the Lone Ranger stories, Tonto. In the story of Don Quixote, it is Sancho. In the stories of Jesus, it's Peter, the disciples. With Moses, it is Aaron. So, okay, you get the picture. And there is, in the development of this story, an enemy. So, in the stories of the American West, the enemy is the Indians. In the story of Jack the Beanstalk, the enemy, right? So you get the idea. Now, what Grema proposes is that this is how human beings tell stories. And that in one way or another, all interesting stories have these elements that can be identified. I'm not sure that I can always identify all of them, but it isn't hard in most instances. And that understanding this structure, then, is helpful in understanding how human beings, how the mind shapes the analysis of the telling of the stories of what's going on in the world. So if you've ever noticed, for example, the president in speeches related to this is always being very clear about the enemy and what the enemy has done, what it is that God is doing in sending freedom to the world via the United States, and that the subject of this is variously the president himself, who God is using to send salvation to the world, and freedom and democracy and so on. That's the object that is regularly addressed in this story, that is constantly retold. And so the agent, the subject of this action of God is then the people of the United States in their representatives. Their helper is the military. They are the heroes. They are the ones who will carry out this action with the help of others. But so then there are individual stories that are told of which a particular person or group or division or whatever becomes the subject. So this story gets recast in various, but it's always basically the same story. And the enemy is then, variously, the evil axis. It is Al-Qaeda. It is Islamic terrorism. There are various names that are given. But the structure of this is, well, you're familiar. Does this ring bells? Do you see how this works? And does it resonate with a story that you have heard and that is sort of structural? Now, what I found in describing this to the circle of conversation was that it was at some level a surprise to Bert, who is the Air Force organizer of the Wright Institute, that the story was so simple, and that the story, it's just a common, well, of course. That's the problem. And implicit then in this is how this problem will be dealt with once it's defined in these terms. And these terms have not been questioned by the entire military-industrial complex, political complex of the United States. So this deep structure of story then is an unquestioned assumption about both what's happening and the nature of the problem. So, you get the idea. Now here's what I'd like for you to do. I'd like for us to take, if we had time, we could spend a week on each of these, but or two. But we have, let's say, 10 minutes, maybe 15.
10 minutes to save the world.
This is to think. This is to be a free and open space in which we can begin to think in story about these larger issues that face the human community. We don't normally do this in Bible study either. We don't do this as biblical scholars. So this is then a way of doing biblical storytelling that we haven't done before. I'd like for there to be a, I'll just name these. I want you to divide up into groups. We'll have a Joshua group, a Joshua Judges group, a 1 Samuel group, a 2 Samuel group, a 1 Kings group, and a 2 Kings group. Then I'd like to have a Matthew, Mark, and Luke group. What I want you to do is to identify the deep structure of this story in relation to, this actantial structure of narrative. Who's the sender? What's the object? Who's the receiver? Who's the subject? The helper, the enemy, and what happens? How does the story proceed? What's its beginning? What's its ending in relation to that structure? Yes?
Could you clarify that term, actantial?
Yes.
That right?
Maybe I can clarify it a little bit. It is, on the one hand, a narrative role. It's a variation of actor. So it is then, in drama, there is, you could use this as a way of identifying the basic actors in a play. In story, which is a more foundational mode of human thought, it is a role in a broader story. So that's one way of thinking of it. Another is that it is a function. It is a part of an action, of a broader action. And there is that function to each of these actantial roles. Okay, so I could go on, but that's a place to start. All right, Joshua Judges.
Okay, I can give you this in 45 seconds.
All right.
You weren't wasted, Lord.
The sender, the big sender is God.
Right.
God, and the sub-sender, Moses. Yahweh and Moses.
Okay.
And the object is the promised land, the land of milk and honey,
Right.
nationhood.
Right.
The receivers
That's it.
would be the Israelites, the
Right.
chosen people, the Hebrews, those freed from Egypt.
Yes.
The subject, of course, is Joshua.
Yes.
We're putting him in there as the 4-star general.
Right.
As his helpers, he has the fighting men of Israel, the army. He has the entire cultic priesthood behind him. He is the patriotic musicians who play the horns.
Right.
He has the symbol of God's presence, the ark, the powerful, powerful ark, and he has, no one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. I will never leave you nor
Okay, so that's-
forsake you. God.
Right.
God is his helper.
Well, but God is I think that's part of God's role as the sender. So these are the helpers, and they're separate characters in the story. God is kind of in the background. He speaks, relates, but he's always in that role, I'd say, as sender.
And the enemy is the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the
Right.
Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, all foreign peoples, the foreign gods, and the inhabitants of the land.
Right.
Legion. Enemy is legion.
Occupants of the land.
The occupants of the land.
And then, so, but it's also the nation, let's call it the nations for now.
The nations.
That becomes a central term in the definition of enemy in the traditions of Israel. Okay? Now, what happens in the story of Joshua, in this actantial structure? What is the outcome of the story?
Well, at the initial, it begins with them crossing the river, taking on the forces of the nations, as
Right.
we heard, and it's a mixed outcome. They managed to drive out some, but not all of the nations. And in the long run, part of what happens is they start to intermingle. So they're successful in driving out some, but in the centuries to come, they are punished for not completing the
They didn't complete the
genocide.
task.
Okay.
They didn't complete the task.
They,
They followed the.
I think they were given a task of extermination, and they didn't.
Okay. That variously could be, we could argue about that in relation to what degree the story is about, total destruction of the occupants of the land, or whether it is the transfer of the land to essentially control by Israel. So that's an ambiguity in the story, and it's an ambiguity that is even deeper if we look at the other stories that are told in Judges and Numbers, which is an alternative underlying story, which is that the land was occupied and by the occupants of the land, and that there continued to be an ongoing negotiation for the land between those who were there and the Israelites. And there were various conflicts, but there were also alliances that were formed.
Yeah.
It's a much more complex story.
Yeah.
But this is the basic story that remains the dominant structural paradigm for this. Now, just identifying this in relation to the ways in which these stories become the architects of policy. I would say that this story is, for many in Israel now, the story. That's the underlying structure for the settlers, for the right, the political right in Israel. This is the story in which then current events are structured.
Yes.
This also is significantly the story that underlies the development of 20th century Zionism. That too is ambiguous, but if you're going to analyze the deep structure of that, and it is also a deep structure that underlies and that is accepted as the pattern of the action of God by the evangelical right in the United States, who have significant, and the neoconservative political group that has taken this basic model for a model not only for Israel, but also for the United States. Okay, 1 Samuel.
Okay,
Oh, and another thing about this. there is a significant degree in this story to which it is successful.
Yes.
And there are new covenants at the end of the story. There's a covenant made with God. And what you were talking about is that God at the end says, if you obey, if you are faithful to this covenant, you will have this land in perpetuity. But if you are not, it will be taken away from you. So that's an underlying story that then is open-ended at the end of the story as to what's going to be the end result of this occupation or this gift of the land.
Can we then draw a parallel between what's happening in the United States today with our problems with this?
Well, the way that would work would be that this actantial narrative structure for people who deeply internalize it and internalize this story becomes a template into which then they place people and events in contemporary life. So this becomes a way of telling the story of contemporary conflicts and how they will be resolved.
But if they don't go to the Bible, if those who are the lawmakers don't turn to the Bible, would they use Bible stories as the template for solving their problem?
They may not consciously utilize this particular story, but the theory of this would be that there are underlying narrative structures in the human consciousness and in the human community, and that the most influential underlying structures are biblical narrative structures. And this is also, if we wanted to be more complex about it, we could also compare this with the structures of heroic narrative in Greece and Rome. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, which constitute another form of this same basic story, but it has the same basic structure. So Zeus is sending civilization to the world by means of the Greeks and Alexander the Great, and the helpers are the armies of Israel, and the enemy is the barbarians. It's all those who are non-Greeks. That's a basic story that runs through the ancient world. There are different characters placed in this, but the same basic structure is present. And it remains the most foundational structure of narrative experience or actantial, however you want to describe this, of the formulation of the stories of the relations of nation states, groups, so on. Different characters get placed in this. So in the Al-Qaeda version of this, it is that Allah is sending peace to the people of the Islamic world. And the subject of this is variously Sharia law, it is Al-Qaeda, it is the Islam, it is Wahhabism and this ideology. The helpers to that are those who are willing to be martyrs and to participate in the jihad, and the enemy is the West. And that story is being told to thousands now of young people in the Islamic world. So part of this is recognizing that this same story is the foundational story that has been told for centuries. Different characters get put in, but it's all the same story. So people are thinking in the same categories of narrative experience. It's just different people get put in it, but it's always replaying the same story.
And if you don't come from a faith background, you can go to World War II, World War I, right? And you can,
Yeah.
insert whatever.
Right. So it may. So you can do this in terms of American history.
Right.
it was the British, then it was, well, the Indians, then it was the Germans, and then it was the Germans and the Japanese, then it was the North Vietnamese, so we placed different, right. Oh, communist was a biggie for a long time, but that's now, so what happens? That ends, so in order to maintain the structures of government, you have to put somebody else in this role. So the government runs around looking for who can we place in the enemy role, and so on. So that's the way that the narrative consciousness of nation states operates, and of human consciousness. We have to plug somebody into this in order to make sense of our corporate lives. And so the names and the positions may change, and especially the enemy changes.
So is peace through power. So is the use of force.
Yes, that's another dimension of what's implicit in this basic model from the Joshua Judges tradition that runs as a basic structure of biblical narrative. Okay, 1 Samuel.
Okay,
And
God.
will you stand, please, so I can get you? Will you stand so I can?
Oh. Well, the overall structure is that God is the,
You want to go there?
Yes, Yahweh's the sender.
God is the sender, yes, the sender. And sends, I would say, safety to Israel.
Okay,
And that Samuel is the subject. At the beginning, the Philistines are the enemy, I think. I'm not sure the Philistines are the enemy, right? Well, a little later into the narrative, when Saul gets anointed king, it's in order to deal with the Philistines.
right.
So the Philistines are the enemy, Saul is the helper, and Samuel perhaps is the subject. A little story.
Well, for the purposes, for a significant part of it, Saul is the subject, I'd say. But
Okay, well, that's what I was going to say, that then later, well, I don't know. Okay, you could say that Saul,
because Samuel dies and the story goes on, and Saul,
in the
Kind of
story
takes
of
it.
David and Goliath and in that bottom thing,
Yes.
Saul is the, I can never remember the name of these darn labels. The subject, they call it sensitive. Saul's subject, Goliath is the enemy, and David is the helper.
right, right. So David, you're right.
Yeah. But then later, Saul becomes the enemy. And David, I
But
guess,
that,
is the helper.
yeah, but
But I'm not sure.
that's in 2 Samuel,
Well,
basically.
when David's
big
running
structure.
around the wilderness, Saul is the enemy, has become the enemy, because he's not satisfying God anymore. He's disappointed God, and he's been.
Okay, so there is a complexity in relations,
Yes,
but
very complex.
the basic story is still Saul as and what happens in the course of the development of this narrative. What's the end of it at the end of 1 Samuel?
Saul is killed.
Right,
by
right,
the enemy.
all right. So this story, then, in terms of its development, has a tragic ending. That's important to notice. That this continuation of this model is told in biblical narrative, its basic structure, as a conflict that emerges between Saul and David. Saul goes crazy and has a tragic ending. And so, in terms of the basic purpose of this, at the end, Israel is more vulnerable than it ever was as a result of the wars that have taken place. So the end result of it is a weakening rather than a strengthening of the people in terms of the object. So there's a way in which, in this story, the organizing consciousness is, in terms of the structure of the story, that the war and this syndrome made things worse.
Can I just ask a question about
Yes.
those two narratives then? Could you also say that it is a tragedy, I mean, the tragedy in 1 Samuel, which results in the degrading of the situation? Actually, it's also true of the previous story.
Yes.
That it,
Yes.
far enough
Yes.
that it's going to go the
Yes,
same way.
yes, and you can see that in particular stories in Judges. So Samson, for example, is an instance of the continuation of this story. Same basic pattern. Samson is appointed by God, empowered by God to deliver the people from the Philistines. His helper becomes an enemy. It weakens him. He is captured. He finally wins a little battle by bringing the temple down on him. But the end result is a weakening of Israel. So it is finally a tragic story. It's tragic for Samson, but it's also tragic for the object of the. So it doesn't. So there are others like that, but it's very, in terms of Judges, there are both victory stories where this works. So Deborah is successful, and it ends positively and stays positive. Does not have a negative downturn in terms of tragedy. Gideon is, there's security for a time, but it's part of a longer story, and this system, in terms of the big story, doesn't work, and the people want a king, which is what starts this. It's another.
Judges is a cycle.
Yes,
They're always
that's right,
starting from
that's
God,
right,
and God
that's
always
right,
step on the
that's
end.
right, that's right.
And then, it's a cycle.
Okay, 2 Samuel.
See how you do?
You got 10 more minutes.
Up here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Can I skip?
All right, go, no,
Just
go ahead.
summarize.
Okay, this is very, very similar.
Yeah, yeah.
God is the center.
Yes,
The object is a united kingdom under God. The Israelites, the tribes, are the receivers. David is the subject. His military
yes,
helps him. And the enemy is all these nations, the Philistines, the Ammonites, etc.
Right.
So it's a real similar story, and of course it ends not happily either. Ultimately.
right. So for a variety of reasons, in relation to the internal conflicts that emerge in David's life, most substantially Absalom, who goes from being a helper, his son, to being an enemy. And the conflict that emerges then, another substructure of this is the ongoing conflict between David and Saul, in which the northern kingdom becomes part of David's kingdom, but there is ongoing battle because of the vengeance that is taken by David's allies and relations. So there are a number of subplots.
And David
But
is
the end,
judged.
yes,
David is judged
yes,
for his
right.
behavior.
So he recognizes it, he prays it, but the end result is tragic. 1 Kings.
Okay. God is sending renewal and unity to the holy nation. As the receiver, the subject is Elijah. The helpers, ravens, Elisha, the 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. The enemy would be the corrupt apostate kings and Baals, if you look at the whole book as a whole. Both Solomon's corruption and of course Ahab.
Okay. Who's the enemy?
The corrupt apostate kings and
Yeah,
Baals.
right.
And it started out so well.
Would you say that, who's Elijah's helper?
Oh, wait, I was saying, okay, he's got ravens,
Oh, yeah, right.
he's got Elisha, and he's got the 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, underlying this story of Elijah is also the story of the division of the nation.
Right.
The division between the northern and southern kingdom, the battles that go on, and they start defining themselves in these structures as the enemies being variously the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. Basically, it's told from the point of view of the southern kingdom
Right.
and the northern kingdom. And another dimension of this is that there's an ongoing war with the, it has, with the Syrians, with the Assyrians. That is introduced as another motif. And what's going to happen in regard to that remains ambiguous at the end.